Namaste, Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. Welcome to yet another session in our Weekend with Wisdom series. And in this week, we are discussing about the topic Indian knowledge system and formal systems. And taking us through this topic, the speaker for this week is Shankara Bharadwaj ji. Namaste, Shankara ji. Thank you so much for joining us. Before I introduce Shankara ji, for the benefit of the viewers, I would like to chant a prayer. Guru Brahma, Guru Vishnu, Guru Devo Maheshwarah, Guru Sakshat Parabrahma, Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Samasta Jana Kalyani Niratam Karunamayam Namami Chinmayam Devam Satgurun Brahma Vidvaram. Om. Shankara Bharadwaj ji is an engineer by profession living in Bangalore. His primary interests are in Indian knowledge and worldviews. His current focus is on theoretical framework for the future institutions of state and society. He is one of the directors of Hindupedia and a member of Samvit Research Center, Hyderabad. We are meeting today for the second part 2 of Indian knowledge system and formal systems. And without further ado, I would like to welcome the speaker, Shankara ji. Over to you, Shankara ji.
Thank you. Are you, is this okay? The sound and video are okay? Or is it cutting?
Yes, Shankara ji, are you able to hear me?
I can hear you.
Yes.
Is the streaming okay?
We are able to hear you.
Okay.
It's a little pixelated, but I think it is working for now. Yes. Yeah.
Namaste everyone. Let us continue from where we paused yesterday. So we want to do a very brief recap of Indian knowledge system and formal system, how we are positioning this topic, and then we want to cover three major items today. One is a brief description of the ecosystem, the traditional ecosystem. Then two case studies on how the formal system notion works in the Indian knowledge. We would like to do a brief tour of Vedanta and Dharma Shastra. Before that, a very brief recap. What a formal system is. A formal system is a set of statements with known truth values. And it has a subset of statements called axioms, which are verifiable but not provable. They're also not reducible. The most irreducible statements, which are verifiable but not provable, will be accepted as axioms. Now, statements that are refutable based on the axioms, they will be rest of the formal system where we can prove them to be true or false. Some of them we call them as theorems, and what follows from axioms or corollaries or theorems, they will be called corollaries. They will be by definition provable. There are two major features of any formal system. Completeness, which means we can ascertain the truth value of every statement in that formal system. Consistency is another aspect where if there are no contradicting statements with known truth values, then we say the formal system is consistent. So we have also seen yesterday how based on the basic principle that a formal system can't be both complete and consistent at the same time, how the Indian knowledge achieves both these features through diversification, through recensions, and ensures completeness at a bigger picture while ensuring internal consistency in each version of the truth. would like to start with today's session. There is a brief description or idea we can present about the traditional ecosystem, how it works, which will help us in further developing this topic. The first thing is, what is the composition of the sampradayas? Because we know that our knowledge ecosystem, or what we call as traditional ecosystem, it is an ecosystem sustained by and developed by the traditions or sampradayas. So what exactly is a sampradaya? This is how we can broadly describe it, though we can't accurately define it. It has, on the left is what it contains at a high level, and a brief detail of it on the right side. So every sampradaya has a darshana, or a view of world. It has its own view of the world, explanation of what the world is. Its major components, namely the individual, or the being, the jiva, the world that we get to see, the phenomenal world, and the absolute or the essential reality of the world. These elements, what are the relation between them? Now, what is causing all the phenomenal happenings and the phenomenal world itself? And what is causing all the experiences, misery, happiness, all these? And then it prescribes methods for minimizing misery and maximizing happiness. This is broadly the goal of any darshana. Apart from this, there is a formal structure where it establishes its hypothesis, then it develops the content. It has a set of pramanas, it accepts, it enlists them, based on which it is going to establish its hypothesis, or it engages in argument with other traditions. And then there is a vada, and then bodhana, its own pedagogy. Apart from darshana, every major sampradaya, mostly they have their own theology. In fact, the Veda itself comes with a very elaborate theology, but every tradition develops it further. The Vaishnavas, the Shaivas, the Shaktas, Ganapatyas, everybody have their own theology developed, very well developed theology, around which their specific rituals, everything will be there. The Devata, the mantra, the yantra, and then the alaya, devalaya, all these. Then there is a tantra, or practical philosophy, where or we can call it the upasana shastra, as far as the traditional ecosystem is concerned, where the sadhana aspects will be there, what is achieved through the sadhana, its goals, its methods, who is qualified for what level of initiation, what kind of practice results in what kind of results, all these things. And then yoga margas would be there. Apart from this, there will also be some apara shastras, or the worldly wisdom component, where some, let us say, the logic would be there, or alchemy would be there, or physical or the astronomical details would be there. A lot of these subjects would be there. Traditions synthesize these subjects also. So it's not, there is no clear line drawn as far as the tradition is concerned. The knowledge, yes, there is a para and apara kind of distinction, but everything is ultimately part of the whole knowledge as a whole. Given this broadly, we can say this is a layout of each sampradaya. It has a darshana, it has a devata, it has tantra, it has other shastras. So basically, we can see sampradaya as a tuple, a composition of each of these things. So now there could be multiple sampradayas subscribing to the same darshana, let us say Advaita. There are many Advaitic darshanas, many Advaitic sampradayas, but each of them would have a different theology. Now there could be Advaitic, Shaiva, Advaitic, Vaishnava also. Same with Advaita. Same with anything, basically. That's why we can see each, and each of them has a different, obviously, methods prescribed, the ruchi, adhikara based on them. So each tradition, although every tradition has all the sheets, each tradition is dominant on some sheets, or some target social groups where it is practiced. This at the high level is a life cycle. Typically, every sampradaya has a life cycle in the ecosystem. The ecosystem survives. Every sampradaya is a flowing stream, but it has a finite life, so to say. So once there is the conception, when a core hypothesis of a darshana has been proposed, along with its own methods, the sadhana marga, all these things, then there is a development that happens where it engages in debates with others. It enriches itself and enriches the ecosystem with its own unique ideas and knowledge. So as this happens, there is a widening application. It expands influence in the society as well as in the traditional ecosystem. And whatever transformation it brings in the society suitable to the times. Then as the development happens through multiple iterations, sampradayas tend to get to their peak, where they get established as mainstream dominant traditions and start influencing several spheres of life, not just the spiritual practices, the social practices, the political realm. A lot of wide impact would be there. Then there would be challenges faced with the time. There will be newer ideas challenging the tradition. So there will be a waning phase where you'll start seeing losses in debates, loss of relevance will happen. So the purposes would be put to question, what the contribution is happening and things like that. There will be stagnation in development. It could be in such a stage, a tradition could either wane out, or it would get revised with it gets hypothesized, or new arguments would be made. So from there, it could either dissolve, it will fade out and dissolve into the ecosystem, or it starts adopting other prevalent ideas. Or after revision, it can go back to its development phase again with a fresh lease of life. So these cycles keep happening. Every sampradaya has seen several such ups and downs. After that, eventually, either it dissolves or it continues. Now, some traditions we have seen, they have lived very long. Some that have been dominant at a time have disappeared. But the main point to understand is this happens very harmoniously in the ecosystem. Every sampradaya contributes in a very positive way. And once it goes out also, the contributions remain. For instance, today, we don't have living Sankhya traditions. The Sankhya knowledge survives, but Sankhya tradition practice, you don't have many. But its knowledge remains and its contribution is seen across several traditions. This also we have touched briefly, but I just wanted to show it pictorially. What are the sheets of knowledge and of society? The knowledge we have in the innermost sheath, the orthopraxy, where the Shraddha, Smarta, Vedanta, inner core of Agamic Tantric, where the formalized knowledge will be there. Along with that, a very rigorous ritual structure would be there. It applies to both Shraddha as well as Agamika systems. Then there would be a syncretic sheath where the focus is not as much on the ritual. The second sheath, or the syncretic sheath, is primarily focused on the practice, so to say. I mean, the practice is obviously there in the innermost sheath also, but it will be major focus on in the second sheath compared to the knowledge component or the formal structures of knowledge. Formal structure would be far more prominently visible in its emphasis in the innermost sheath. It keeps decreasing in its prominence as we go outwards into syncretic, or once we go to regional and folk layers, it will be much less visible as a formal structure. The knowledge would be there. It's not the depth of the knowledge that is in question, but the formal structure of the knowledge that will be waning as we go outwards in these sheets. With this, two case studies we wanted to do on applying this formal system notion two different subjects. The first one was I wanted to take is the Vedanta. As we know, it's a Vedanta is a darshana. So what does a darshana contain as such? Darshana is a view of the world. It presents the nature of the world as this darshana sees, as this subject sees. It could be even Vyakarana is a darshana, for instance, Nyaya is a darshana, Vaiseshika is a darshana. Each of these have their way of explaining the worlds and explaining the causation. And then it propounds its own goals, typically what we say as Abhyudaya and Nishreyasa, or happiness of the highest order. That is the goal that every darshana pursues. And then what does it contain? Primarily, it contains a causation theory, how the world has come about. What are the primal principles underlying the creation or manifestation of the world as it is visible for us today? And what is governing its operational dynamics? What is the underlying principle? Then what is the source of our phenomenal experience? This happiness, misery, all these things. What is the source of these experiences? And then it gives methods. How do we maximize our happiness and minimize our displeasure, misery, whatever is undesirable? And then it has a pramana, a set of pramanas. Every darshana spells out its own pramanas that it uses to know the essential nature of the being and of the world. And it uses the pramanas to establish its core theory, its main hypothesis. It uses a lot of these, most of these depend on Astika pramana. Darshanas use the Shabda pramana also. But Shabda pramana is also there in the Nastika darshanas also. It's just that they don't position it this way. But they have their own content where they take as an axiomatic reference. And darshana is by nature a hypothesis, a theory towards the explaining the world as well as attaining happiness. Therefore, it is by nature refutable. Every darshana is refutable. And it engages in arguments, systematic arguments to refute other positions as well as to establish its own position. And darshana is at the very core of every tradition. So every tradition has its darshana component, which makes it not just its refutability, but it also establishes its methods by which it will expand and grow. From this perspective, if we see Vedanta as a darshana, it propounds its own view of the world, obviously. Now, Mimamsa has its own view of the world. It presents what the world is, how it has come about. Nyaya has. Similarly, Vedanta propounds its own view of the world. And then it establishes its own hypothesis based on the accepted set of pramanas. Now, here, largely with some variation, Vedanta accepts all the pramanas that the Mimamsakas propound. In fact, Vedanta is Uttara Mimamsa, so there is a lot of commonality in the formal structure that they follow. So all the 6 pramanas, the Pratyaksha, Anumana, Shabda, Anupalabdhi, all these things, all the 6 pramanas are accepted by the Vedanta Darshanikas. It has at its core, when we come down to Shabda Pramana, it has its axiomatic basis. It accepts Shruti or the Veda as a whole. The whole Veda is the axiomatic base. Then it also accepts all the Smriti Prasthana as a Shabda Pramana, where the Pauranika, Smriti, all the such literature is there. The major arguments of the Vedanta or major hypothesis, they are established through the Vedanta Sutras. This again is very common across the darshanas. There is a sutra grantha where all the core hypotheses are established or enunciated. Then we have further development that happens through the, the clarifications happen, the claims and counter arguments, all this kind of things happen through the commenting text primarily, like bhashya, vartika, karika, vyakhya, tika. There are several types of commenting texts for each sutra. This is where all the argumentation, counter argumentation happens. Of course, these are partly timely relevant, but they are all targeted at explaining the core hypothesis. So now if we see Vyakarana, we have the core sutras, then we have the Bhashya on it, there is Karika, all that. Sankhya, same, there is a Sutra, Bhashya, Vartika, Karika. In case of Sankhya, we see the Sutras and Karika very prominently. They are more popular than the Bhashyas. Whereas in Vedanta, we know that the Bhashyas are very popular. So it's not very uniform, but these are the main elements that we find. And which is what we would find in any scientific scheme, where there is a core hypothesis, it's established, there is a derivative text which is doing further development of the text, it is establishing things, it is getting refuted, all these things. The other aspect is obviously engagement in Vada or argumentation with peer traditions, where the clarifications or counter arguments, all this come about. So both these put together become the argumentation in favor of the main hypothesis. They are deductive, not just deductive, but we have a reference to text, non-text, or we have sometimes empirical reality, which is accepted across the board. It's not as if that needs to be proved. What is accepted, we don't need to prove. While all this formal structure is there, it is also known that Vedanta, like any other major tradition, practicing tradition where the first-hand experience, that remains the primary goal, where without the practitioner's experience or without the practitioner-centric set of practices, no tradition seriously pursues any subject. It's primarily for the practitioner that this whole formal structure is there. Formal structure, what it is contributing is not an obstacle to the practice. It is primarily ensuring that what is practiced and experienced can be done at scale across times. The permanence and breadth of applicability will be very limited if we are not formally positioning the subject, or we don't have a formal structure. The authenticity and formal structure becomes very important for any sustainable knowledge. In that sense, its scientific rigor, all this becomes relevant. Now coming to the sheets, as we have seen here. In case of Vedanta, how do the sheets look like? The innermost core obviously is the Darshanika, where the core hypothesis is propounded, the knowledge is developed. And then we have the second level where the practice is more prominent. Again, no need to restate that practice remains in the innermost sheet. It is not purely theoretical, but in the outer one, the theory's importance reduces and the practice assumes greater importance. And then we have indirect beneficiaries. There is impact of this school on the other schools and other theories, what they have contributed through their mutual engagement. And then its contribution in terms of social practices, refinement of the code of conduct and things like that. Let's say the practices in temples or all these things. They evolve over time, but traditions, different traditions have different levels of contributions in that evolution. And Vedanta as a darshana, if we see it, integrates most elements of the ecosystem, the knowledge component, the practice component, and it takes all the way to the lay level practitioner. While it has the most rigorous inner sheath, And it is evident from the data. It has survived, Vedanta has survived polemics and debates. It probably remains the only unvanquished school. Right? I mean, Nyaya or Vaisheshika or Sankhya, any darshan if we see, they have seen several cycles of rise and fall. They have been refuted several times. They have been rephrased, re-hypothesized several times. And that journey continued for a lot of them. Some have actually finally accepted their defeat. But Vedanta probably remains the one that has never seen that kind of downfall. Every time there has been a challenge, Vedanta did come out successful because it has the most abstract formulation of the real nature of the world. And by virtue of that abstraction, it actually frames several multiple frames of reality and stratify the experience of reality in a way that it is a permanently sustainable structure. And it has very elaborate epistemics to sustain this kind of hypothesis. While it is having that kind of rigor, it is also the most widespread at the common man psyche level also. Not every one is conscious, but a lot of unconscious statements that we make, we don't realize how much of the impact of Vedanta has been there in such statements. Even as an abuse, somebody says, if somebody does this thing, he won't have any birth or death. In fact, what it is indirectly saying is Janmarahitya, but it is also indicating that kind of awareness of the nature of the world, and which has actually been percolated by the Vedanta. And then the sense of seeing divine everywhere, that needless to say, most Indians understand that. And then appreciating the temporary nature of life, temporary nature of the fortunes, rise and fall that we see, all these things, this Vedantic mindset, if one has to say, that has come down excellently through in all the social strata, which is a roaring success for a darshana like Vedanta. It doesn't have to remain as a formally stated system in every sheath, because for some only theory matters, for some theory doesn't matter. But the fact that this theory has percolated through all the layers is what establishes how well that school has succeeded. And behind that success, there is this formal structure which could take it through all the levels. So at this point, before we go further, because there will be slight change in the topic, we can take any questions if anyone has on the Vedanta and the ecosystem.
Viewers, requesting you to kindly post your questions in the Q&A box. What is the world view of Vedanta? If you could expand on that, Shankaraji.
Is the world view of Vedanta? Vedanta primarily, it's about what is causing our binding and liberation. Basically, if I have to put it in a very simple way, what is causing our binding is our ignorance, and what will cause our liberation would be our realization of reality. There is nothing like becoming divine. Right? Everyone is divine, or the self is already the liberated one. It is not that self that is getting bound. It is the false knowledge that is covering up or veiling the self. That is what is causing the binding.
Right.
How does this get established in the Vedanta is the main thing. So for that, it establishes a higher frame of reality, where in the higher frame there is no binding or liberation that is applicable. None of this concept is applicable. This whole binding liberation is all that is happening in the phenomenal frame only. Once you transcend the phenomenal frame, there is nothing like binding or liberation. There is no knowledge or ignorance. So it's basically that getting that, transcending that frame of reality is what, that is how Vedanta propounds it. Now, there would be, since there are many darshanas which are Vedantic, let us say the Dvaita, Advaita, there are many darshanas. So they have their own specific interpretation of this. For instance, the Visishtadvaita propounds it in a different way. Whether some accept the Jivan Mukti, some say it is possible, some say it is not possible. Your ultimate liberation happens only after the body is left. And then there is a gradation of moksha they propound. But across all this diversity, for a darshana to be Vedantic, primarily it is about accepting the binding and non-binding. These apply only in the phenomenal frame. Ultimately, the self is always in a liberated state.
Wonderful.
Maybe it's possible that my Advaitic prejudice is coming across here, but that's whichever it is. I mean, you accept, you don't accept, doesn't matter. The point is Vedanta. If you don't take Shankara, Ramanuja, anybody, and just go to the Brahma Sutras or the Gita or the Upanishads, broadly this is what comes across.
Correct. Right.
Binding and liberation are, and this is in a different way Sankhya says, but there is that frame of reality has not been propounded very clearly in Sankhya.
Right.
So
we have some questions. Could you say something about formal systems vis-a-vis Vedanta?
Yeah, so Vedanta has formal system very similar to what any darshana has. That is why if we go back, so in the this is the formal system part. There is a what is a formal system? It is a set of statements. It is a body of knowledge with some axiomatic basis, and then you have refutable statements which are refuted, proven or disproven based on the axioms, and a set of known acceptable methods of proving or disproving. In case of Vedanta, that is exactly what applies, right? I mean, there is an axiomatic basis, which is the Shruti or the Veda. And then the Vedanta's proposition of what the world is and how the binding and liberation happen. It is its hypothesis. This is the hypothesis part. Or you can call it a theory. Theory is again a set of statements which, your hypothesis. And is it refutable? It is refutable. It has been established through its pramanas. So in that sense, it abides by almost everything that you can call as a formal system. The darshana hypothesis, its shabda pramana component, and how it establishes hypothesis, and then how it refutes the other darshanas. This whole thing is part of a formal system.
Wonderful. We don't have further questions as of now. We can continue, Shankaraji.
Right. So the second case study we wanted to take was the Dharma Shastra. Before dwelling into the details of what Dharma Shastra contains and all that, but the knowledge of Dharma, what are the sheets inside this? Because now how it relates to a formal system we want to establish first and then go further. Firstly, how does the knowledge of dharma or righteous order derive? It's at the root level, its main statement comes from a statement of the cosmic order or the Rita, which is an Arsha or the Arshaya stated by rishis. That is the Shruti. It's more like the ultimate nature of the world at the most impersonal and timeless, in a most timeless way, or timeless level of statement about the world. That cosmic order says, I mean, this is how the world works in general, or this is how the universe works in general. And then there is a corresponding natural order component, which we call as dharma, basically. So that cosmic principle, which works in every being or in every visible aspect of nature, that is the natural order or dharma. That we will again find in the Shruti, and it gets restated in the Smritis to various degrees. And how that again relates to individual, his experiences of life, his own conduct, and how it reflects in the social order. This is both Arsha, and it is given by both the rishis as well as the experts on the various subjects. And this again we find mostly in the Smriti and later texts. Later, not in the chronological sense, but later in the hierarchical sense. And what is not stated, the unstated and extraordinary situations where we finally take recourse to, we don't find any references or knowledge available. So we take recourse to the Sishtachara, or how knowledgeable and people with probity in their character, as well as known to be knowledgeable, their conduct has been in similar situations. And Antakarana, how we ultimately, what our conscience is approving of. So these are the different levels in which this knowledge of the Dharma is available. Of course, this is a very brief and condensed statement, but this is sufficient to look at the formal structure part of it. Now, where is the formal structure coming? We do have our axiomatic content in the Shruti. Then we have a component of that axiomatic content restated in the Dharma Shastra, along with a very elaborate deduced content in the Dharma Shastra based on that axiomatic content. So that derivation is what we'll need to understand. The Dharma Shastra is not directly stating things on its own as a Sata Pramana. It is taking a Parata Pramana. It is depending on the Pramana of the Veda, because ultimately Veda is the Dharma Mula. From there, the impersonal and eternally stated facts of the essential nature of the universe. It is deriving what is relevant to the time-space bound world, where individuals and society can relate to this order and derive their own best conduct. So based on that axiomatic content, this derived content is there. And then there are more elaborations. We have additional sections, separate sections for the temporal content. Then we have refutable content. Then we have other forms of statement. Basically, there are some content is ontological. It is just stating the nature of the world, or nature of individuals, or nature of how the society works, or the innate nature of the state as an entity. And what is not ontological, you could have prescriptive content or normative content, saying this is how you should be doing things, vidhi or nishedha, if you want to call it, do's and don'ts. Those are prescriptive. You should do this, you should not do this. And that also has different levels. Some are advisory, saying this is the right thing. Now it is up to you what you do. Some are more normative, saying this ought to be done, this ought not to be done, which is a very, very rare case. Only in case of, let us say, extreme cases, we will have such kind of normative statements. In a lot of other cases, it would be either advisory or ontological in nature. And then Apart from this formal structure, we also have a semi-formal structure where they following Sishtachara or taking recourse to Antakarana. Those things happen. Even when we take recourse to Antakarana, there has to be probity in conduct. That is what is. So it is not arbitrary. In that sense, it is not informal, but it is semi-formal. So the Dharma Shastra, as far as Dharma is concerned, is making a statement of what Dharma is. And what we find in the Itihasa and Purana is an illustration of this same knowledge through stories, through the conduct and statements, action and statement of different characters in the Itihasa and Purana. Now, in case of when we relate to Sampradaya and Achara, because this Acharana of Dharma is where the main focus always is going to be. From the practitioner perspective, how would he think? For me as an individual, if I have to do, my question would be, what is appropriate for this situation? And how do I know I am doing the right thing? If I were an academic student, on the other hand, I would be worried more about, preoccupied more about how do I determine what is the right thing, what is not the right thing. It's a more theoretical question. A sociologist would have a different take on it. Who will decide what is right? I mean, establishing authority and this kind of normative structure, which we don't actually see in a Sampradaya context. That contrast, if we see, then we will be better positioned to understand the nature of the content that the Dharma Shastra has. And within formal system, how would we frame the question? How is the inconsistency and ambiguity resolved? How do we ensure there is determinism in what is prescribed as a right conduct? And then how is refutability and probity ensured? And this is what is making it a formal system. So we have 4 different layers in which we can see things operating in society or in state. One is the manifest or visible layer, where we see codes of conduct, do's and don'ts would be there. In case of state, their policies, laws, all this would be there. In social context, we have our achara vyavahara, all these things. What is underlying this is an architecture. There is an architecture of institutions, the structure of institutions that are governing the happenings in the state or the society, or it is creating an organization for things to run in a seamless way. What is underlying the architecture is a doctrine by which these institutions are created, or a doctrine to fulfill which the institutions are created. And underlying the doctrine, where does the doctrine itself come from? Let us say a king should strive to ensure all the people are fearless and they are able to pursue their occupations, and they are peaceful, they are fearless of crime. Where does this doctrine derive from? This doctrine in turn derives from a worldview, a view of the world, because nature of man is to crave happiness and peace. It becomes imperative that these things are established in a society. So if the nature of man is something else, if the nature of man is to crave conflict, the doctrine would come out in a very different way. So the worldview, while it's not very obviously stated in most documents, it becomes the most important component based on which rest of the 3 layers of content get derived, and which is why we find a very clear, unambiguous statement of the worldview in the Dharma Shastra of how the world has been seen by the text, seen by the rishis, as codified in the text. And the goal is also very clear. Dharma, enunciating Dharma, it's already done in the Veda. So restating Dharma in a way it is relatable to individuals and society. That is what is the goal of a Dharma Shastra. So it is stating the goal. Fulfilling Dharma is the goal of everyone. And who is giving the instruments? How do we fulfill that? Those instruments are coming from Artha. Artha is the means to fulfill Dharma. So Ardhashastra is the Shastra that gives you instruments to fulfill your dharma. In the state, in the context of society, we have different individuals pursue their Ardha in different ways. In the context of state, Rajadharma is fulfilled through the instruments provided by Ardhashastra. Now coming to Dharma Shastra itself, how the text is there and how do we understand its formal structure. To start with, it has a Sanatana content or eternal and impersonal content. It says this is how the world came about, this is who created what and what came after what in the sequence of creation, what has happened. Why is this important? We have just seen. Unless we know the nature of the world, we can't derive a doctrine that is deterministic. It is only making things more epistemically sound or pramanika by stating these things. Apparently, for an onlooker, it looks like, I mean, why do you need to know the nature of the world to be able to state a good code of conduct? Unless we know the nature of the world, we don't know what is the nature of the good conduct. So the Sanatana content is there. Now this is a timeless content. So this doesn't change across texts. Most of the Sanatana component will be nearly the same across all the Dharma Shastras you find. It spells out the worldview. It tells the nature of the world. It tells the nature of man. And it spells out the purposes of man, meaning and purpose of life, so to say. And then from this, it lays down a doctrine. Based on that, it derives and establishes a doctrine for running the state and society. This is partly prescriptive in nature. Whereas if we see the Sanatana content, it is ontological in nature. There is nothing prescriptive. There are no do's and don'ts. There are no norms established. In the doctrine, we are deriving a doctrine. There is a refutable content in the doctrine. Therefore, it also has normative content. Then it also has recommendations for jurisprudence, how the judiciary works, how do you preserve the structure of the state and society, what are the institutions that are there. And all this content is revisable. This is not timeless. But at the same time, this is also not very time space specific. This is giving a permanent structure, which is evolutionary in nature. So we don't have to keep restating it. We give its general principles in the text, in the permanent layer, based on which the manifestations keep changing from time to time. So broadly, now these are the three layers we have seen. That is how any Dharma Shastra would have. It has a Sanatana content, it has a Yuga Dharma, which is very vast time spans, but not entirely timeless altogether. Then we have a Desha Kala component, where what is applicable in a given region, what is applicable for a given time, what is applicable for a given situation. These three layers have been very clearly demarcated and separated in the text, so that we know what changes, what does not change, and what changes on what principles, what it changes. And those principles, where do we find? We find those principles in the doctrine and in the worldview. Based on that, we can change all the temporal content. And it has been changed across the Smritis. We see a great variation in the Deshakala components. So now the Sanatana can be called axiomatic, or you can say it is a repetition of what axiomatic content we find in the Shruti. All the non-axiomatic content, it can be evaluated both for correctness in a deductive way. Is it deriving correctly from the axioms? Is it establishing its deductions or conclusions correctly? Is the right method applied? Or is that content applicable in time and space for the current situation? What is applicable, what is not applicable? So across all this, we can establish the validity of the non-axiomatic portions. And what is whose correctness is not established, or correctness has been refuted, that content is more prone to change. Time space, anyway, we know that the practical manuals followed in different places, they keep changing. For those, we don't typically take recourse to something like a Dharma Shastra. So as an example of what it contains, if we take Manava Dharma Shastra or Manusmriti as we call it, what does it really contain? If we break it down into the different chapters it contains, can we decipher a formal system in it? And can we decipher this separation of these layers of content? So firstly, it contains a statement for the organic whole. It's not specific to just society or state. It has code for everything. It has code for people, for different geographies, code for life, which is universal. Then the cultural component, most of it is covered. Then it defines the state with respect to the nature of the people, their code of life. So it's not actually starting with the state. It is stating this is the nature of this civilization and this society. Because the society is like this, the state will be defined to serve this society in certain fashion. So the state doctrine is deriving directly from the nature of the society and is not agnostic of it. And state does not make anything normative for the society as far as this scope is concerned. And how does all this content get covered? How do the epistemic structure, how does it look like? We see the Manusmriti, the first chapter, there is absolutely no legal component involved there. It is talking about creation. It is talking about the being. It is talking about the different bodies of the eternal being. It is explaining the nature of the world, nature of time, and it is describing nature or prakriti. And then it is giving a description of temporal nature or different yugas, what is happening. Then it is explaining the varna or the permanent nature, threefold nature of beings, which again is not applicable as a social construct, merely as a social construct. It is basically there is varna in the devatas, in the trees, plants, planets, everywhere. So this is basically anything that is natural has threefold nature or threefold in nature, anything that is visible in nature, and it obviously has a varna component. So therefore, in that sense, it is a universal concept. It is a worldview component rather than a temporal or social construct component. Then it explains the importance of knowledge and how to pursue the study of the various technical subjects. Then from here it comes from gaining of knowledge, eternal knowledge, then it is starting to relate the eternal to the phenomenal. It is in this section, it starts speaking of the desire, human desire, inspiration for action, how the individual is or any being is inspired to do certain actions. And then what are the sources of understanding what dharma is or what the natural order is? How do we understand it? What are the sources? And then the qualifications for people to learning and teaching this subject. What qualifies somebody? There is no grouping or anything. It's basically the technical qualifications that it is giving here. Then it is coming to the landscape. The law of the land is defined based on the nature of the land. So basically it is giving the geography and mentioning to what geography it is applying these laws and how these laws are going to be eventually derived from. Then it has some description of the regions, different regions where what kind of rituals are conducted, for who it is most appropriate to live in which region. So this is more, as we see, it's a prescriptive content, but it's not normative per se. because we know that from time to time there has been a wide variation in the practices. Then it comes down to life code, initiation into learning, the samskaras, then the brahmacharya, then the learning process, basic code of conduct. How do you respect people? How do you respect elders? How do you treat different individuals? So as we see here, again, it's primarily about individuals and the collective, what is best for it. Then it is more prescriptive content when it comes to the Grahastha's code of conduct, what he needs to do, how the selection of the life partner happens, then the rituals of marriage are there, there is a wide variance. As far as these are concerned, we need to take note that this is a very variant content, in the sense, for practitioners of different traditions, they have different rituals laid down in their specific manuals. In the general manuals, what we don't have that kind of specific group specific details. What we have is a very general level detail as a reference point. If society as a whole is following these norms, then the state has to do something based on, or state has to formulate laws based on this agreed conventions. In that sense, it is stating it. So in that sense, it is not normative exactly. It is descriptive of what is accepted by the different traditions. Now these Prayashchittas are there, rites done for Pitru Devatas are there. These are all mentioned in a way, they're not. So for instance, these smritis are not the primary sources for this. The primary sources happen to be the sutras specific to each tradition. Now the Apastamba is there, Bodhayana is there. Each has its own code of conduct laid down. The rituals are very elaborately laid down. The Shravata Sutras are there, then the Gruhya and Dharma Sutras are there. The Kalpa put together lays down what they need to practice for each tradition. In that sense, also, this is not normative in this current scope. And coming to the next chapter, then chapter 4 is more, it has Yuga component, it has the Samanya Dharma, it also has Varna Dharma. Fifth chapter, it has more code for Grihasthas. Again, there is nothing legal about it. It's partly Yuga specific. It details the food code, then it has Tri Dharma, then it has Shaucha, or general purity as well as ritual purity. Purity is probably not a very good translation, but Shaucha, that's the immediate word that comes to my mind. Sixth chapter also, now it has details, the previous two chapters details about Grihasthashrama. Now the sixth has description about the code of conduct for a Vanaprasthi and a Sannyasi. When do you undertake it, and what is the contribution each individual does during those phases in life. So far, it's been half the text is done. It is primarily about the individual conduct, social conduct, and it has been about the nature of the world based on which this conduct has been derived. So we can see how the refutable content is derived and established rather than simply stated as a normative fact or normative ideal. And it is also not stated as a moral fact. It is stated as it's derived rather than stated. From after that start the normative and prescriptive content. The second half of the book, the Dharma Shastra, this is where the real prescriptions, all these things come. Because based on what we have established, this is the conduct. For this conduct to suit a society that honors this kind of conduct, how is the state going to look like? So it starts with Rajadharma. What is the ideal conduct of a ruler? What are the do's and don'ts for a ruler or head of the state, if you want to call it? Here, it also makes sense to take note. When one says Rajadharma, you can see it as a duty, or you can also see Dharma if it is a natural order. It is also explaining the innate nature of the state and the conduct of the head of the state. So in that sense, it is primarily ontological. Then it is deriving the norms of conduct for the ruler, by which he can actually succeed in what he is doing. So it briefly mentions the instruments at the disposal of state that the state can use to do its job or govern people, serve people efficiently. So as mentioned, Arthashastra is the specialized subject where the instruments are dealt in a very elaborate way. The Dharma Shastra briefly mentions them. Their elaboration we will find in the Arthashastra. So then it has details about the selection of capital for a empire, for a state, capital city, then composition of the mantranga, and then the ministerial group, then the appointment of diplomats, other high officials. Is this eternal? Obviously, it is not eternal. There is nothing permanent about this. This is prone to change based on the evolution of the concept of state. But at the same time, it has some very fundamental principles that are permanent. That take any state would have all these components is a given. In that sense, it is permanent. The specifics of what it should contain, those are going to evolve with time. Then it details the protection of the state, which again has to be done. It is a timeless requirement. Fortification, how it is done, what is the strategy for external affairs, how do you conduct a war. Again, war technology has evolved, so it's not as if this content has to be honored forever, but it has again very valuable inputs on the principles of war rather than the technical specifics of the war. And technical details obviously won't come from a Dharma Shastra, they come from Dhanurveda and other texts meant as war manuals, which have been codified afresh from time to time. Then it details the appointment of officials for the entire geography, what kind of officials need to be appointed in which region and things like that. And how do you prevent corruption? How do you do taxation? How do you give salaries? How do you ensure the deserving ones or the underprivileged ones, they are exempted from burden of tax? And then how do you find the right ones to protect the state in case king is either incapacitated or he has certain capability limitations? You can have a token king, but in which case, how do you ensure the other ones, which portfolios have to be governed by which kind of individual, so that the state runs smoothly regardless of individual? So again, as we can see, the system is given importance, it's not the individual. And then there is a routine and life code for head of the state, how he is supposed to conduct, what principles or ideals he needs to ensure, including primary ones like probity. He needs to ensure probity in his conduct. So far as we have seen, now all this looks like a bunch of recommendations, statecraft, all this, but all this still abides by the notion of the formal system. All this content is derived, established, and is refutable on certain basis. The doctrine is derived based on the worldview, and the prescriptive content is ratified or can be refuted based on the doctrine. So that logical establishment continues through the text. Then after that comes the definition of the state doctrine in a more emphatic way, the jurisprudence, the penal code. How do you ascertain the methods of ascertainment of any event or crime? And then the nature of evidence, how do you treat what is evidence, what is not evidence, and how do you see witnesses? So all these things are dealt in this chapter. This obviously is normative and prescriptive. It prescribes, do this, don't do this, this is advisable, this is not advisable. It's a very clear given do's and don'ts. And here it again takes a turn in the next chapter, chapter 9. It is a partly legal component, in the sense it is acted on by state, and partly it is not acted on by state. Now there is Stri Purusha Dharma, Stri Rakshana, how do you protect women? What are the privileges or the rights that women need to be given and things like that. It, as a responsibility, it lies with the state, but and also with society. Then it has prayaschitta component, where the violation of individual code of conduct and what prayaschitta needs to be done. Now, this is not enforced by the state. This is prescribed specifically for individuals. Here the state is not coming into picture. And then there are different details about the types of offspring. Let us say who is Auraja, Datta, Kshetraja. Based on this, now why is this kind of detail required here? It is the ontological basis again. This is spelled out. Based on this, the inheritance laws, all these are stated. So within this, if this becomes refutable, let us say there are more types of offspring, then your inheritance laws would be changing based on this stated content. So this stated content is refutable in that context, and then this, what is derived, is automatically refuted by the refutation of the above, and then has to be reformulated. So we can see how the internal structure is maintained within the text to ensure consistency. Once the root content changes, the derived content changes. And without the change of the root content, the derived can change with respect, as long as it is still aligned with the root. And this happens across. Now, 9 is dependent on, let us say, the nature of the world described earlier. If that changes, all of this changes. Although that is permanent knowledge, and but it's a different level of transformation altogether. Then the rationale for state for imposing penalties. Is there a penalty philosophy of penalty? How do you, I mean, it looks like very obvious that there is a crime, there is a punishment, but on what basis do we apply? Is the goal of the state to transform? Is the goal of the state to deter crime? Is the goal of the state to ensure some level of fear in the criminals? What is the goal? Here it's very clear. Transformation is stated objective, but more than that, it is said that individual actually suffers by not paying a penalty. We do something wrong, we don't pay the penalty here, we pay it elsewhere. So it is better for the king to ensure the proportionate penalty is imposed right here, and he is helping individuals so that their parartha does not suffer. So this puts a very different philosophical basis for how the jurisprudence is actually conducted. Now, rather than saying you need to ensure a proportionate penalty, the importance of proportionate penalty has been established here. Then what are the violations that state has to punish? As we have seen, there is a violation of code that individuals expiate for. Here, it is listing out what are the violations that the state has to interfere and act upon. Then we have the fines, collection of fines, all these things. And how does the fine get collected, and what is the state expected to do with those collections? Then once the basis of penalty is established and nature of sin and all this is established, or papa, I mean, it's not exactly sin, then the penal code for these offenses or violations has been defined. This is not a timeless content because penal code keeps changing, number one. Number two, the situation of the society keeps changing. So based on that, the rigor of the punishment, all these things keep changing from time to time. And then there are penalties specific to each one. Now again, how relevant is it if we have to formulate a new jurisprudence? That's a question for future. So there the legal content largely ends. Now the 10th chapter, it doesn't have much legal content. It talks of intermixture of groups, code of conduct for each of the group that comes as an output of, as a result of intermixture. Then again, some more prayaschitta is there, sin and expiation. Then apadharma is there, the code of conduct in extraordinary situations. Then in the subsequent chapter, there is a breach of code of conduct for different individuals. What is the prayaschitta or expiation they need to do? The last chapter is paramarthika. It has some legal component, but by nature, as it is said, it is more about the other world and all that. So the guna karma, the nature of these things, that is explained. Then the afterlife and the subsequent lives. What kind of life do individuals get based on their conduct in the current life? Why is this relevant in a Dharma Shastra? Because this is putting our whole life in a frame. And it is saying there are other frames that exist, which influence the current frame that we are living in. So the afterlife actually governs in a way. It's not fear of the other afterlife or anything. It's primarily to understand the causation and how we ensure our current life has the highest probability and ideal conduct. And then there is a description of what is moksha and what is knowledge, the nature of knowledge, and then where to gain the knowledge in case that is not already gained so far through the Dharma Shastra or the Shruti, the alternate sources of knowledge. And then there is the who is eligible to judge dharma adharma, and what is the qualification of somebody who makes those judgments about the code of conduct. So basically, in a way, it is about jurisprudence. It's not exactly about jurisprudence or creating the juries. It is about establishing the people with probity in conduct who are accepted in the society as the experts. So it's not always entirely just the state component that is there. There is a society component involved here. Then there is the Dhamma Parishad, which is established by the state, a set of jurors or the Nyaya experts who are going to pass these judgments. So as we can see this, there is time specific component, a very temporal component in this. But all this temporal component has been established based on a timeless component in certain ways, and saying that there are time-space components, the Deshakala, the region-wise and situation-wise, there are. So all these changes, if they have to, or all this content, if it has to change to suit the future, or in a way it sustains for in times to come, there is a very good basis laid down within the structure of this text that can enlighten us on how to develop the content further based on these permanent principles. So before we go further, Hariji, any questions we can take at this point?
Sure. Thank you, Shankaraji. Requesting the viewers to post your questions in the Q&A box, please. So it was interesting to note the multiple layers of the Dharma Shastra. You had mentioned about the individual, the society level, and also at a governance level. So could you please highlight the various layers of the Dharma Shastra once again?
Yeah, the Sanatana, the first layer, which is eternal, is timeless, and also impersonal. It is universally applicable. This again has two internal layers. All the Sanatana content has again internal layers where there is a separation between the permanent nature and the cosmic order. So the cosmic order is what we derive typically from the Shruti, where it is stated as the eternal nature and all that. From there, we derive the permanent nature of the visible world, which is what is restated in the Dharma Shastra. So the Sanatana content of the Dharma Shastra will be more about this, the second order one. The first order one still remains in the Shruti. Then we have the Yuga Dharma. So Yuga Dharma, we can again see it in two forms. One is, if you say any Yuga can be seen at any time. It is basically the Yuga Dharma, Yuga Nirnaya is done by the current order established in that region. So today, I mean, you can have Krita Yuga in this region, but Kali in another region. So it's basically that that society and that ruler can change things within their best of abilities. Like Parikshit had actually postponed the Kali. We also see within the Kalis, many kings have attempted to establish Krita Yuga and all that. But then if for each Yuga, there is a very well-defined definition, right? So this is the nature of Dharma that operates in this Yuga, saying Dharma operates on this level. This is Yajna specific. This will be focused on knowledge. This phase will be a knowledge phase. This will be a Yajna phase. This will be a Tapas phase, that way. So this variance has been very clearly documented. So based on which Yuga is operating, your large trends will be there. If you see large time spans, the conduct will remain the same over for that specific Yuga. And Yuga Sandhi, obviously, when you transition from one to other, there will be a change, a visible change. But during that Yuga, it will be a constant, nearly a constant trend. So this Dharma component, when it is stated for Yuga, it is basically about for that Yuga, what is appropriate. So in that sense, it is not altogether unchangeable, but it is nearly unchangeable. It is a finite set, basically. If this is the Yuga, you have a very clear mapping of what happens there. The third layer is Deshakala, which is basically, Desha is the cultural unit, right? Our geocultural unit, we have 56 Deshas in the Bharatavarsha. Each Desha has its own unique cultural traits, its local practices, all these things. So for that Desha, people's conduct, and for that people of that group, that Sampradaya, what is the code of conduct that applies? And Kala. For this situation, let us say crime is very high. You need to start imposing inordinate punishments, very high disproportionate punishments, to create fear and bring down the levels of crime. And eventually, once the crime is low, you don't want to apply disproportionate punishment, but you want to keep maintaining the fear, so there should be some level of punishment. So the things keep varying. These variances get captured in the Deshakala layer. Now, if we look at the modern republic, how do we best relate? Now you have a constitution, you have a state list and a center list. What is permanent for Yuga and the Sanatana obviously will go into center and gets replicated across. There is no variance there. There will be a great variance in the Deshakala layers between the center and the state. Every region will have its own dominant component of the Deshakala components. For these groups, how the marriage codes work. Some have matrilineal groups, some have patrilineal groups. Some places polyandry is allowed, some places polygamy is allowed, some places it is not allowed. So this gets codified because if there are groups with different codes that are interacting, that is when the state is acting as an arbiter, and state should not be clueless in how to deal with these combinations and permutations. So this is primarily the purpose why all these things have been spelled out in the Smriti. So it's not exactly to say this is how you are supposed to be conducting. It is telling we need to understand it is a recommendation for the state. It is not a recommendation for the individuals. It is telling, see, people are like this. Now you have to deal with all this. These are the instruments you have to deal with these people. So if state has to arbiter between a patrilineal and matrilineal groups dispute, property dispute, what is the state gonna do? So these are the challenges that state is faced with, and it can solve only when it understands what is inviolable for each group.
Right.
So in that sense, it is, the recommendation coming from the nature of the society itself
Hmm.
and nature of the society at that particular given point of time, as accepted by its own experts.
Hmm.
So this gets codified as a Deshakala. This is why now, obviously, there is a civil participation. All this code of conduct, its codification doesn't come through the state. It doesn't, and it cannot come top down from the state. It gets codified from the village, from the Desha upwards.
Hmm.
From these experts, local experts, it's going to get codified. And that knowledge of what has been codified goes up. So it is bottom up in terms of codification of all these Deshakala layers.
Right. And this is starkly different to the present systems, isn't it?
Exactly. It comes top down.
The
laws come top down for us, which is a problem.
Right.
Whereas the Sanatana content and Yuga component obviously comes top down. There is centralized and
True.
there is no variance. So it has to
Right.
come top down.
Right.
It is universally acceptable.
Universally accepted. Yeah. Yeah.
Across the Bharatavarsha.
Hmm.
What is Deshakala typically builds bottom up.
Right.
The local panchayat, all these things, the code, and because there is a great variance from region to region, from time to time.
Right.
And these conventions have to be accepted by the people if you have to impose on them.
True.
So we can't have a constitution that we have not ratified, right? I mean, that's not unique to democracy. Whether you have a democratically elected government or not, the fact that the rules that we are governed by are ratified by the society.
Right. Right.
And there has to be probity in this process. By what process you have ensured these laws have been accepted by the state as the laws that this society accepts it, to be governed by.
Right.
And this process, there is a probity established, basically a very clear, transparent process established in how this happens. So for these three layers, does this explain?
Yes.
So the Dharma Shastra, yeah, I mean, as a formal system, it doesn't immediately strike us, but once we start looking at it as a formal system, we start seeing all the four layers. The worldview, and how do you derive the doctrine from the worldview? How do you derive the institutions of the state? Now, if we see how does these state institutions or the social institutions get codified?
Right.
How are you saying that state should have a treasury? How are you saying the state should have a judiciary?
Right. Right.
How are you saying that state should have a minister for external affairs? Intuitively, anybody can say, but you can't codify things for a state by intuition.
Correct.
There has to be a knowledge base for doing these things. And it is not simply based on the problems we have faced. The people have problems, so I need to appoint an arbiter. How does an arbiter solve anything unless he has adequate knowledge to do that arbitration? So this again comes top down. This doctrine gets derived directly from the worldview, from the nature of the man. Nature of the man is basically to fulfill his purusharthas. That, I mean, you innately crave to fulfill yourself more than anything else in the world. And the statement of fulfillment is purushartha. Purushartha is not some duty assigned by somebody. It is your innate nature to be happy. And your happiness comes in fulfillment of your potential. And your potential gets fulfilled through in these four forms. Dharma, Adha, Kama, Moksha. So it's not, again, this is definitely not top down. This is ontological. This is coming from an understanding of the nature of man.
Yeah.
If man is not all this, if man is not fulfillment craving, if man is an economic being, your doctrine would be like communism or capitalism.
Makes sense.
So this doctrine is derived based on your statement of the nature of the man, which is your worldview. And this is what makes this document systematic, right? If you see
Exactly.
Constitution, there is no statement of the nature of man.
Correct.
Why do you have to be socialist? Why do you have to be a democratic republic? It is arbitrary. It is a wish. We want to be this. But why?
Why? Yeah.
Unless I establish why I want to do that, there is no rationale for changing it.
Right. It becomes an axiom. And
Arbitrary. The changes are arbitrary.
right.
The changes are not systematic, or there is no probity in the nature of the change. There is a systematic argument we develop and derive our goals.
Right.
So a lot of people think that stating a goal is a good starting point. But goal is also a conclusion.
True.
Philosophically, your goal for your life is a conclusion from your understanding of your purpose of life.
Very beautifully put. Yes.
And that is what is coming through the statement of this Sanatana content. The worldview is stated, the nature of the world is stated, and based on the nature of the world, this doctrine is systematically derived. Why king has to ensure probity, it is explained. So if you, obviously Dharma Shastra only states the goals.
Right.
There's a lot of detail, and if you see the Niti Sutras, the Shastra detail, they actually go a lot into the specifics of conduct of the king.
Right.
And the illustrative texts of Dharma Shastra, let us say the Mahabharata or Ramayana, there is a lot more elaborate detail on the nature of the conduct of the king, what is ideal conduct, and what is the consequence if the ideal conduct is not followed. And whatever happened in the Sabha, in the Mahabharata, it has laid down foundation for a great destruction.
True.
Where the king ensures probity, like Rama did. We know the consequences. He could establish an ideal rule. At a great cost, of course, to his personal life.
Yes.
But it's very clear. If you have that level of conduct, then the fruits will come. And if you don't have that level of resilience in character, fruits are there to be seen in the Mahabharata. So illustrations are there of the principles, and those principles have been stated in the Dharma Shastra. And these principles are mostly repeated in the Artha Shastra in an axiomatic way. In the Dharma Shastra, they have been derived from the worldview.
Right.
In the next level of the text, this becomes the source text. This doctrine is a statement of axiom in the Artha Shastra. And that is the starting point. From there, it tries to work out how to achieve all these things and gives instruments to implement this.
Wonderful.
So for the Artha Shastra, whatever is taken as the axiomatic core is in fact derived in the Dharma Shastra.
Right.
So text on text, if we see, it becomes a very beautiful formal system.
Formal system. There are the, it feeds into the other, and it derives from the other, and it keeps building further as you speak.
Exactly. Exactly. And from there, it is partly true also to see that ultimately real life is real life. Your real life is not governed by theory.
Correct.
But real life is actually governed by theory. It is just that we don't end up stating it clearly enough. And that is a limitation that the modern systems suffer. Modern systems don't sufficiently state the ontological basis of their theories in a way that they are refutable and correctable. So if you can't correct your root theory, there is no way you can correct your doctrine of operation. And this is the lesson the Dharma Shastra is actually given as a timeless lesson. If we have to derive and build things, define things for our future.
Right.
The ideal systems can be derived by following these 4 principles. And ensuring these 4 levels of content is maintained in a internally consistent way.
Wonderful. So I think, tying it back to the inner sheath layer, when there is no enough emphasis and focus on the inner sheath layer, then whatever your doctrines of operations also would lack the premise on which it
exactly they lack a basis of operation.
Yeah.
So they become arbitrary.
Mm.
So now it's always fanciful to say, yeah, based on what we people wanted to build, we got a state like that, but it's not really like that. The intent of people hasn't translated into a theory of state. It has only translated into people who can govern them.
Correct.
But those people, whether they can build the theory or govern by the theory that we think we can, there is no probability in that at all. Neither is it happening, nor is there a mechanism to ensure it is happening. So now we can't say that this government should change these laws and those laws. They can't change because there is no theoretical basis for change.
There is no inquiry in the first place. Right.
There is no inquiry, and this critique can't happen in a populist way, right? This critique has to happen through a formal system, in an academic or in a systematic way.
True.
And that kind of systematic debating environment itself is not created.
Yeah.
It is, again, you can say these White Houses, parliaments, all these things are places where such debates should happen. True. But the people who get elected are not the experts in formal structures. They are only experts in winning people's hearts.
Right.
So and that is again where the appointment, if you see, there is a very clear rationale given as to what kind of position you need to appoint what kind of individual. For certain positions, it's not populism or popularity or anything. For certain positions, it is their expertise and technical rigor that matters. For certain positions, you need them to be really popular. So that they can take the right position to the people and convince people about what he's doing.
Wonderful. It's really mind-boggling to put it all together and establish the narrative right now. Yeah.
Once we have a narrative, I mean, it can't be either Manu or Yajnavalkya or anything. Ultimately, each of these is giving us the structure.
Right.
So the main takeaway for us is we need to have a formal structure if we have to build our systems. And we need to establish the basis or the frame for that. And that is the greatest takeaway. More than we can take the specific, this punishment is good, this punishment is bad. And that's a very, it's a fourth level, basically. We are talking about the manifest fourth level of detail of specifics of what is done, what is not done.
True.
And at each different times, it may feel some is good, some is not good.
Right.
That keeps changing. But then again, it remains arbitrary unless the structure is built. So, which is my primary proposition at this point.
Wonderful. We don't have further questions, Shankaraji. We can go ahead.
Yeah. So to draw conclusions, primarily, as we have seen with our discussion, it is a formal system is not limited in Indian traditions to just the academic subjects like mathematics or philosophy. Formal system or formal view of knowledge, formal structure of knowledge pervades all forms of our knowledge. There is in metaphysics, you find it in Dharma Shastra or in social codes, everything, code of state, we find it. We find it in, obviously we will find it in technical subjects, maths or physics or those. We will find it in astronomy. The ritual structure or ritual sciences in the traditions, the practicing traditions, they have an equally sound formal system underlying their practices. So it is very clearly established why a certain ritual is done, how it is done, what is the fruit that comes if it is done, and what happens if it is not done. There have been debates across traditions there have been disagreements, and there is a very clear way to understand these disagreements. Every tradition is internally consistent. It doesn't agree with another tradition. There will be inconsistency across traditions, but within each tradition, there will be an internal consistency. The same applies to understanding of Dharma also, apart from the Sanatana. On the Sanatana, there is largely no disagreement across traditions. They all agree. On the Deshakala, there will be a wide variance across traditions, across social groups, across regions. And that is why, to suit each of their needs, the content has been stratified and diversified. And we do achieve completeness across all this at the root level of this knowledge system, which is the eternal content. And because we have one grand knowledge system, it is not just different subjects with interdisciplinary action. It's not building bottom. It is coming top down, saying this is the world, this is the universe, and this is the nature of the universe. And then there are different ways to express the workings of the universe. So you have a physical way of looking at it, you have a biological way of looking at it, you have a metaphysical way of looking at it, you have a grammatic way of looking at it. Vyakarana is a darshana. So, which is our sound way of looking at it. Again, it has several internal ways. The Vyakarana is one of them. You look at all the world as sound. So each of them is a darshana, or it's a way to look at the world, and each of them eventually adds up into that big picture of what the world is. And while there are different methods followed by each of these subjects, right, each of them has its own pramanas.
Yes.
But their ultimate statement, they have to comply with a certain formal structure of what rules they are abiding by in terms of vadana, bodhana. So that there is a mutual interaction and they are working in a harmonious environment, all traditions. So that ecosystem is sustaining all this, enriching all this knowledge is getting enriched within that ecosystem because they have this harmony and agreement on the basic principles of argument.
Right.
And imparting the knowledge, the pedagogy. As we know, as we get more into the leaf level, we will see more specific knowledge. And the more specific it gets, the more, what do we say, incomplete it becomes in a way. Because we are losing the big picture at certain level as we dig deep into a specific aspect. Although this deep aspect eventually circles us back into the general one.
Right. Could we say it is like a reductionist, it reduces the whole into a finer, smaller aspect, but eventually goes back, as you say, ties back to the primary whole. Yeah. Wonderful.
And as knowledge, so society. So if our society replicates the structure of our knowledge, which is the case in Hindu knowledge, actually, our society also has the sheets. Our knowledge also has the sheets. Because this replication happens, we don't need actually to either create arbitrary subjects. We can actually tie in all the relevant subjects into that organic whole, where there is an internal consistency we achieve. And each of them is consistent with the whole.
Right.
When we don't really need to have a specific academic doctrine. We will have a cultural economy. That culture itself is the governing principle for both the state, society, as well as economy. That is the holistic view. If we define an economic view of man, it doesn't tie into this big picture. And it also doesn't tie into your worldview, how you are defining the nature of man.
Right.
You don't find yourself fundamentally compatible with this view of ourselves. We don't obviously relate to that theory in a perceivable way. We live with that theory because it is right now enforced and it is working. And it won't sustain very long. So for sustainable systems to emerge, we can't start with these operative dynamics. We have to start with that worldview from which we can derive these doctrines. We should be able to derive the economic doctrine. We have to be able to derive the political doctrine from that organic whole or our worldview.
Right.
And that worldview itself, now I might have created a slight confusion, because a darshana, by definition, is a theory. It's not an accepted fact. It is an accepted fact only for the adherents of that tradition.
Right.
Here, when we say worldview, which forms the basis for Dharma Shastra or Artha Shastra, this is a universally accepted worldview.
Right.
All the traditions accept this is the nature of man, this is the nature of the world.
Right.
So that common component is what we find in the Dharma Shastra or the Shruti. What we find in specific darshanas is how they are restating their position in terms of the spiritual elevation and all these things.
Right. Could we call it the means? Maybe each darshana has its own standpoint with respect to the means, or also, as you said, the sources are.
Because each darshana also has its own causation theory.
Causation, exactly. Yeah.
It is not giving a story of creation. Each darshana is not giving a new story of creation. The story of creation is there in the Shruti itself. But the causation, each darshana is presenting in a different way. The causation is important because based on causation, it is giving the moksha upaya. So the means it is prescribing based on its own establishment of causation. And that causation it is restating. Every darshana is restating according to its own lights.
Right.
So I mean, I just wanted to clarify. Otherwise, because if darshana is a theory, then logically you can't tie it as a worldview formula basis for Dharma Shastra.
True.
So it is not that.
Yeah.
So primarily this is, I mean, why I wanted this conclusion is based on this, we can only on basis of this kind of structured view, we can envisage a holistic system design for us. If we want a design of social institutions or institutions of state or institutions of education or the civil participation in state or any aspect of this or economy, the institutions for future can only be organically derived if we understand this formal system and formal structure of knowledge. And based on this, we should be able to state the doctrine of each of them.
Right.
So with that, I conclude, Hariji. Any further comments or questions you have?
Sure. Thank you so much, Shankaraji. It was such an enthralling experience for me to just make sense of the whole system as such. And it put a lot of things in perspective for me, to say the least. And with that, I would like to request the audience to post any questions if there are any in the Q&A box. And it was simply striking to just think of how the worldview itself, there are different standpoints in our systems. Like, it's not just one worldview that is shoved or thrusted, but there is scope for even a different stance at the worldview level itself. Is very interesting to note. That was very striking to me. Yeah.
I think there was one question: what is axioms? What is theorems?
No. This was in as a supplement question to this is a supplement question to an earlier question. We have taken that.
Okay, nice.
Also, if we want to system or would it be possible to question the ontology, the worldview? Because as you said, many of it is not based on a so-called worldview or through inquiry. It has been given because it has been taken as some problem is there, and so this is the way in which this can be solved. But fundamental questions are not dealt with. So
that is the case in the modern system, basically. We see the problem, we state a solution, but the ontological basis has not been laid down in constitution or any modern sociological text, basically. But that's not the case in Dharma Shastra. We actually, the ontology can be refuted. If you are saying man's nature is threefold, tomorrow you can say no, it is fivefold.
Right.
A rishi who can delve deeper into the nature and state, let's say, I mean, hypothetically, it may or may not be more, but theoretically speaking, if somebody is to state that nature is fivefold and not threefold, he would have to then go back, make the changes at the root level of text.
Right.
And then from there, all the Shastras would change. Dharma Shastra would have to change, the Sankhya would change, maybe Vedanta would change.
Right.
But will that mean you would have to throw away Vedanta or Dharma Shastra? No, because they have both the permanent and the temporal structures. If this is the nature, we are dealing with it in this way. Okay, your problem statement changed. My method will also change accordingly.
Wonderful. And
that frame, reality frame, as long as we have defined in a distinct way.
Right.
Obviously, the Brahma Vidya is not going to change because the man's nature has become tenfold. Because Brahma Vidya is not Vishwamimams, right? It is not about the phenomenon.
Right.
Brahma Vidya frame is after you have transcended all this. Correct. So that is not going to change even if your nature is now instead of threefold, fivefold, or 10.
It's irrelevant. It's immaterial. Yeah.
Exactly. So that because those frames have been defined clearly,
correct,
based on the scope of how you are questioning ontology and what you have changed, the scope of our change would be well defined.
Wonderful.
So tomorrow, if you have to change, probably add a few more mantras, let us say, to the Shruti. Obviously, there is a reason why people started adding to Khila. We have not seen enough case to add to the Samhita directly. But assume you have to.
Right.
It will change the Samhita. It will change the Pratishakya. It will change the Anukramani. Then you will have to change the corresponding Brahmana portion. You will have to change the corresponding Shrauta Sutra portion, or the entire Kalpa based on whatever. So, is this even required? If it is required, obviously all this has happened in the past. All these have been maintained so that they could be changed. All these indices for the text are maintained precisely so that if something at such a root level changes, all these accordingly will be changed and the checks are there. So it's impossible to corrupt it.
Wonderful.
So that similarly our Dharma Shastra also, I mean, the structure is maintained in a way, as we have seen, one derives from the other. So you can't randomly change one and expect that corruption will sustain. The corruption wouldn't happen at that level unless you would have changed rest of the structure to suit this. And that can happen only after enough deliberation and consensus across the board.
Correct.
Individuals can't corrupt it.
Right.
Within their operational capacity. So yeah, you can definitely question ontology if there is a enough epistemic basis and soundness in our argument. And if it is acceptable, definitely yes, we can change things at any layer, but we'll need people of that knowledge, order of knowledge to make that change.
Just to be able to discern and acknowledge these two levels of that which is permanent and temporal, and to be able to meander through that is I think is a good point to start with for all students and seekers. I would say that would be my takeaway. Keep that in mind as I do my studies. Yeah. All right, Shankaraji. Thank you so much for this, and we shall conclude the session now. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Namaskar.